Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. Something a little different today. I'm going to tell you a story. And that story is going to start with a confession. I've become a Tilerholic. There, I've said it and I feel better. It all started so innocently as well. There I was, a 16-year Linux user. I'd always gone down the straight line, used a full desktop environment, and ignored the constant nattering in my ear from the YouTube people telling me, try a window manager, you don't need a desktop environment. Just try OpenBox. You'll like it. You'll enjoy it. And I resisted those calls for a long time, but there's one particular guy out there, let's just call him DT for now. He never gave up. Try a window manager. Try a tiling window manager. You don't have to be a programmer. It's easy. In fact, here's my configs. Try them out. Well, that's the freebie, isn't it? And once you've had the freebie, you're hooked. So I did. I tried OpenBox. For me, that was the gateway. I was hooked. I liked it. But once you go down the window manager route, you're constantly looking for that next thrill, that next buzz. OpenBox led to i3, which led to BSPWM, then on to Spectre WM, and I have to admit, I've started to play with Xmonad. What next? I'm going to find myself up at DWM if I'm not careful. So what do I do from here? Do I need therapy? Do I need rehab? Well, let's discuss it after the intro. Okay, welcome back. Right, the introduction was just a little bit of fun, but like many of these things, there's elements of truth there. It has got to a point where it's been 4 months since I've actually booted into a full desktop environment. And I am now at the point where I very much doubt that I will go back. The tiling environment has become quite familiar to me, and what started off as a little bit of an experiment, and an experiment that certainly wasn't without its frustrations, has become very familiar, the norm, and very comfortable. So I thought I'd take you on a little journey, the journey that I've personally gone through over the last 4 months, to take you to where I am now and to talk a little bit about the stages that I've gone through. A few weeks ago, I produced that video about Linux users, and I categorized them. And I think in many ways, the experience I've gone through in the last 4 months has pushed me through a series of categories as well. I've just been writing them down here. I think I started off as something I'll call a reluctant tourist. I moved on to becoming a frustrated traveller. I then became an adrenaline junkie as far as tiling was concerned, and finally became the Tilerholic that I seem to be growing into at the moment. So let's start with the first stage and talk about how it all started. So I really am placing a lot of the blame for this journey on DT, DistroTube, because I think without his videos and his constant assurance that moving to tiling was a good thing and it wasn't that hard, that I probably never would have tried it. But I also think I'd got to the point about 4 months ago where as a long-time Linux user, I'd always used a desktop environment, and for quite a number of years I'd used Mate, and it was all becoming a bit stale. It was easy, everything was working. As you know, I use Arch for play and Debian stable for work, as I always say, and it just worked. It just worked. It wasn't a challenge anymore. Yes, I enjoyed using Linux, and yes, I would always be an enthusiast, but I suppose I was at the point where I was looking for that little extra. And I think this lockdown period probably gave me the impetus as much as anything else to go out and try something new. So I decided on OpenBox to start off with, and that was a revelation. Using OpenBox, I found I was able to customize it to my liking pretty quickly, and I did start to question whether or not I needed a full desktop environment at that point, because OpenBox was pretty much doing everything I needed it to do. And so I jumped into tiling, and I jumped into tiling quite reluctantly, really. I kept getting comments on my videos after the OpenBox video I produced, saying things like, you need to try tiling, Steve. Try tiling and you'll never go back. So I thought, well, look, I'll do it. And it was something I'd tried in the past. I'd done a quick installation, played around with the likes of i3 for a couple of hours, uninstalled it and thought, well, so much for that. Back to what I know. But I thought, no, come on, give it a chance. And so I did install i3. But when you first move over to a tiling window manager, it feels alien. Everybody has a certain way of working, and moving from a floating desktop environment to a tiling window manager is a big shift. And I felt completely uncomfortable. For those of you who caught that video I did last week about moving over to Fiori BSD, where I felt like a complete newbie, I felt exactly the same going into tiling. And I wasn't particularly happy about it. I was struggling to remember key bindings, and the whole thing just didn't seem to be working. So I probably didn't give i3 a chance, and I moved on to BSPWM, and I forced myself to stay there for a few months. And gradually, I started to remember the key bindings, to get used to working with a tiling window manager, but there was still that element of frustration. And this is when I became what I call the frustrated traveller. So by the time I'm on BSPWM, I've promised myself that I'm going to stay with tiling for, a month or two and force myself to get used to it. But there were a lot of frustrations. The big frustration I've had with each tiling window manager I've tried is the bar, getting the bar configured. And with BSPWM, it was polybar, and that caused me no end of frustration, trying to figure out exactly how it worked and to get it looking how I liked. And I was just making mistakes all the time, and things weren't happening, and I was taking snippets from people's configs, including DTs, and it just wasn't what I wanted it to be. So at that point, I tried a few other tilers. I stayed on BSPWM as my main desktop, but I installed Qtile and I installed Xmonad, and I had a go at configuring them, and the experience wasn't good. I probably wasn't convinced yet that tiling was a great thing, and be it Haskell or be it Python, both of those languages are indecipherable to me. I just don't get it. I can work my way down a bash script. I can read a plain text file. Python and Haskell, it doesn't matter which one it is. I find them equally difficult to follow. And I got incredibly frustrated. So I deleted them and I went back to BSPWM and I thought, right, I'm going to make this work for me. And I started exploring things that I hadn't looked at before, like Rofi and various bash scripts, and continued playing about with Polybar, and finally got it to a point where actually it looked pretty good in my mind, and it was working okay. And I realized at that point that actually I was reaping some benefits. I'd never previously used workspaces. I used to stay on the one workspace and just minimize everything to the panel. Well, suddenly with a tiling window manager, you do use your workspaces as a matter of course, especially when you've got a multi-monitor system. And I was quite impressed with that as I got used to it. So I was being won over. But I have to say that the big thing that won me over was not becoming convinced of the benefits of tiling, but also it was the learning process itself. The learning process, which in terms of, looking at various scripts and getting them working and finding other ways to do things, gave me a real buzz. And I realized that what I was doing was almost going back to when I was first learning to use the Linux desktop, and I was getting a huge buzz out of making things work. And I started then looking for all sorts of other things that I could add on top of the desktop. And I suppose you could almost call me an adrenaline junkie at that point, because that's where, rather than frustration, I'd see a difficult config file and think, right, let's see what we can do with this. So let's talk about that adrenaline junkie stage. So perhaps 3 months in, I'd say I moved to this stage. I'd got BSPWM working as I wanted it to work. I'd explored lots of scripts, so I had lots of pretties on the bar. Polybar was working as I wanted. I'd learned all of the key bindings. I'd created a load of key bindings myself. I will never go the route of just using the terminal all the time. Not by any stretch of the imagination. I still use PC Man FM. I still use Genie. And I'm sorry, I still use Firefox or Chromium. I'm not going to go, completely down that route, although I must admit that I have played with NeoMut for email, which I got working. I'm not going to transfer to it. It was more a case of a project to see if I could get it working. But hey, bottom line is I got the tiling window manager to work for me. It started to feel comfortable. And combined with having extra time, this lockdown, I started to look for new challenges. And new challenges included new tiling window managers. And I moved over, as you're all probably aware, to Spectre WM. And I spent at least a day putting the configuration file together, and absolutely love that. Bit of frustration, but a real feeling of success when it actually worked. And I committed to staying in it for a month. And this coming Friday, I'll have done a month with Spectre WM. And what can I say about it? Well, interestingly, these tiling window managers all work pretty much the same. So I didn't find the experience on Spectre WM that much different from BSPWM. And not surprising, really, because I'd brought my key bindings across. So I was using it in the same way. There was no element of frustration there. I found that I could adapt to it very quickly. And I was very impressed with it. But of course, I'm at the stage then of looking for that new challenge. And in the back of my mind, there's always been that niggle. You failed with Xmonad. You failed with Qtile. It's time to go back, and it's time to try and get Xmonad at least working. Let's put Qtile to one side for the time being. I don't know what it is. There's something about Python. I just can't see it. Haskell, I can at least see a little bit of logic, but Python, it's not there for me at all. Maybe it will be in the future, but hey. So I thought, well, how should I do this? And I thought, last time you pulled down somebody else's config. I think it might have been DT's, but there was a few tries with different people's, and it failed. It failed. I just couldn't get it working. So this time I thought, right, let's build up a configuration file from scratch. And I very nearly went back into the frustration stage because I just couldn't get it working. So in the end, I gave up, and I downloaded DT's config, which, as you probably know, is full of just about everything that Xmonad does. And I didn't want it to do everything there. So I slowly started trimming away at the config, bringing it back to basics, until I got to the point where I had a configuration and a working desktop that just did what I needed it to do. And if I wanted to build on that after, I could do it. And it took me many, many, many days to get a working config. I was sat here with the configuration in front of me, and it was almost a case of what can I safely delete? And I was going through the configuration, commenting out particular sections, then trying to recompile to see if it worked. And of course, there was the Xmobile config as well. But I finally got it up and running. And wow, what a buzz when it's up and running. To the point that I said I'd stick with Spectre WM until, for a month, until this Friday. But I'm then going to move over to Xmonad. And I think by this stage, I'm pretty much reaching the Tilerholic stage. So this is where I am now. I'm a believer. I enjoy using a tiling window manager. It's become familiar for me. I find it straightforward to use. And I don't think moving to Xmonad is going to cause me many more frustrations. If truth be known, my configuration pretty much looks like my Spectre WM configuration, and most of my Spectre WM key bindings have been transferred across. It just works. So it's almost been an exercise of, I'm not going to let this one beat me. I've been using it, and there's a few things that I've really learnt along the way. I am tending to use the terminal more than I used to. I was always a terminal user, but the fact that it's so easy, super enter, you're into a terminal, I don't know, there's just something about tiling. You tend to use it more. I've started to look at things that I didn't look at before, getting my man pages coloured, using Exa instead of LS to get a nice coloured output. I've become more concerned about the overall theme of my desktop. And I've lost some of the reliance that I used to have on things that at the end of the day, I don't quite know why I had a reliance on. A good example here is the system tray. BSPWM has a system tray, or at least Polybar does. So it wasn't an issue, but Spectre WM didn't have a system tray. I played about with Treya, and I played about with Stallone tray, and I wasn't happy with how it looked. So I decided to kind of go the route of not having it. And to be honest, I'm starting to question why I ever bothered. I only had 3 things in my system tray. I had Network Manager applet, I had the PMAC tray, and I had the little volume icon. All of those, there are command line alternatives. It's really not caused me an issue. It's not like you access them that much. And so when I went the Xmonad route and I configured that, I purposely avoided putting a system tray in because I don't actually need one now. And I have come across some benefits. I mean, it's forced me to learn things and to do things that I hadn't done before. One of the recent things that I did was set up my GitLab page. I'm still not fully up to scratch with the knowledge of how that works, but I've set up a GitLab repo. I'm not quite sure how I transfer that across to another computer if needs be. But anyway, that's all set up and I've got my config files or my dot files up there. And I recently came across one of the benefits of doing that. My little ThinkPad X220, I decided I'd put Xmonad and Spectre on that. And I just did a git clone of my GitLab tree, dumped the config files in the right places, and I was up and running in a matter of minutes. A few little tweaks here and there to account for the fact it was on a single screen, but it took minutes to sort and it was done. So I've become more of a believer in the importance of dot files now, which I paid very little attention to before, if I'm honest. What I particularly like about tiling, for me, it's this being forced to use workspaces. And initially I thought that the big advantage was if you were using a multi-monitor setup, it just makes sense to use different workspaces for different monitors. It works great. But actually, even on a little laptop, it makes sense. Rather than having 3 or 4 programs all minimized to your panel, I just have them on different workspaces. So even with a laptop, this tiling paradigm works for me. So have I become a Tilerholic? Well, I'm certainly going through that stage at the moment, but more than anything, it's because I'm enjoying the process, and I will try a few more things as I go along. Will I go as far as DWM? I don't know. I have qualms about, the documentation is the source code. What? But I'll probably give it a go after some point. Is a tiling window manager better than a floating window manager or a full desktop environment? I still think it's a matter of preference. I could quite easily go back to a desktop environment now. It's been the challenge more than anything else. And something that struck me when I was thinking about comparisons, it's amazing how we can get used to something. And once we're used to something, we think it's better than anything we've used before. Many years ago, here's a little story. Many years ago, back in the 70s, the late 70s, I was in the Merchant Navy. And in the Merchant Navy, we used to have a bar, and the bar was basically just a big fridge that was full of tins of beer. And the particular company that I worked for always bought a particular brand, Tennent's, cans of Tennent's, and we all drank Tennent's beer. Anyway, there was a particular time, I was on the big super tankers, the oil tankers, and we went down to South Africa, and it was time to stock up, and there was no stocks of Tennent's. So instead, we had to take on board a new brand, and I'm not sure what the name of it was. It might have been Castle or something similar. Anyway, there was uproar. Nobody liked Castle. Everybody wanted Tennent's, but there wasn't any Tennent's, so we stuck with it, and we got used to it for a few months until we slow steamed back up to Europe, where we were able to replenish our stocks, and we got Tennent's back on board. What was particularly telling for me after those couple of months of us all drinking Castle was when the tenants came back on board, we had people rooting in the bottom of this big fridge, trying to find cans of Castle, because they'd become so used to it that they'd learned to like it. They didn't want to go back to tenants. They wanted to stick with Castle. And I think there's an element of that with these window managers, that you tend to like what you're used to and what you feel comfortable in. So I've gone through this stage of swapping over from a desktop environment to a window manager, to a tiling window manager. I've now got used to it. Will I stay here? Who knows? It depends what else comes up in the future. But I think it's been an interesting journey. So with that, guys, this was just a quick story. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you're liking the hot weather. I must admit it's getting a little bit hot for me at the moment. Don't forget to join me on LBRY, and come and join us on the OldTechBloke Facebook group, which is getting quite busy now. And have a great week.